The room felt colder than ever, despite the warm glow of the bedside lamp. The air between them was heavy, thick with words unspoken, emotions strangled before they could escape. Emma stood frozen, an ultrasound report trembling in her hands, her fingers gripping the edges so tightly that the paper threatened to crumple. Her heart pounded violently, each beat echoing like a scream inside her chest. She had imagined this moment so differently, telling her husband he was going to be a father, expecting his eyes to light up with joy, for him to pull her into his arms and whisper about their future. But reality was cruel. Across the room, Ethan stood by the closet, stuffing his shirts into a duffel bag with mechanical indifference. His back was turned to her, his shoulders relaxed, as if he were merely packing for a weekend trip and not walking away from the life they had built together. Emma swallowed hard, stepping forward, willing her voice to remain steady. "Ethan, please. Can we just talk?" He didn't even pause. "There's nothing left to talk about, Emma." Her breath hitched, disbelief flooding her veins like ice. "You're leaving me? Now? After everything?" Finally, he turned, his face an unreadable mask of detachment. No guilt. No hesitation. Just indifference. "Emma, don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll be fine." "Fine? Fine?" Her grip on the ultrasound tightened. The weight of the moment crashed into her, suffocating, unbearable. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the roaring in her ears. For a moment, a fraction of a second, Ethan hesitated. His eyes flickered to the paper in her hand, then back to her face. Emma held on to that hesitation, searching for something, anything, that resembled the man she had once loved. Then he sighed. An exhausted, uninterested sigh. "Emma, this doesn't change anything." Her knees almost buckled. She had prepared for a lot of things, but not this. "What?" He zipped up his bag, expression void of emotion. "I need to be with someone who actually excites me." The words hit like a slap. Her entire world tilted, spinning, shattering. "Excites you?" The words barely left her lips, disbelief tangling with heartbreak. "I'm carrying your child, Ethan." "We were supposed to." "We were supposed to what?" He cut her off, voice sharp, cold. "Live some picture-perfect life with white picket fences and baby showers?" "That was never what I wanted, Emma." Her stomach twisted violently. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. She shook her head, gripping the paper like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You told me you loved me," she choked out. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "Emma, love isn't enough. I can't do this. I need more." Something inside her cracked. "Who is she?" she asked, voice eerily calm, even as her insides screamed. He didn't deny it. Didn't even have the decency to look surprised. He just smirked, a small, arrogant twitch of his lips. "You don't know her." Emma felt the floor slipping beneath her. "How long?" "Does it matter?" A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her throat. "It matters to me, Ethan. It matters to our baby." But he wasn't listening. He slung the bag over his shoulder and walked past her like she was a stranger. Like she was nothing. Emma's breathing turned ragged. No. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to go. She reached for him, one final, desperate plea. "Ethan, please." He yanked the door open. Didn't even turn back. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the silence, vibrating through her bones. And just like that, he was gone. The ultrasound slipped from her fingers, floating gently to the ground. Emma's body swayed, the weight of the moment crushing her, pressing her down until she collapsed to the floor, clutching her stomach as a sob tore through her chest. Tears blurred her vision, pain wrapped around her throat like a noose. She gasped for air, for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. Nothing but the faint sound of her own voice, whispering to the child growing inside her. I'll raise you without him, and one day, he'll regret everything. The world outside kept moving, indifferent to the storm inside her. Cars honked, people laughed, life carried on as if nothing had happened. But inside Emma's tiny apartment, time had stopped. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless hours of silence. Loneliness clung to her like a second skin. She had never imagined herself here, pregnant, alone, abandoned by the man who had once sworn to love her forever. Ethan's words still echoed in her mind, slicing through her like a dull blade. I need to be with someone who actually excites me. Emma sat curled up on the couch, clutching the ultrasound photo tightly in her trembling hands. She had stared at it for hours, tracing the tiny shape of the life growing inside her, wondering how Ethan could walk away so easily. Didn't this mean anything to him? Didn't she? The answer had come when he walked out the door without looking back. The betrayal was one thing, the humiliation that followed was another. The moment people found out that Ethan had left her pregnant, the whispers began. They spread like wildfire. Did you hear? He left her for someone else. She must have done something to push him away. No man wants to stay with a woman who's pregnant and alone. Emma tried to ignore them, but they were everywhere, at work, in the grocery store, in the pitying glances from old friends who didn't bother to call anymore. Even her own mother looked at her differently now, disappointment clouding her features. One evening, as Emma stood in the kitchen preparing a meal for one, her mother sighed heavily. You should have tried harder, Emma. The words felt like a slap. She turned slowly, her throat tightening. Tried harder? Hadn't she given everything? Hadn't she begged? Hadn't she loved Ethan enough to believe he wouldn't leave? But none of it had mattered. The pregnancy wasn't easy. She was constantly exhausted, morning sickness drained the little energy she had, and the loneliness was unbearable. There were nights when she lay in bed, her hands resting on her belly, whispering to the baby inside her because there was no one else to talk to. No one to hold her. No one to tell her she would be okay. She went to doctor's appointments alone, sitting in sterile waiting rooms watching happy couples hold hands, rubbing the backs of their wives, whispering soft reassurances. She swallowed the lump in her throat, blinking back tears, pretending it didn't matter. She worked extra shifts, pushing through nausea and swollen feet because there was no one else to help her. Bills had to be paid. The baby would need clothes, diapers, a crib. She skipped meals just to make sure there was enough money at the end of the month. But the worst moment came in the grocery store. She had stood in line, a small cart filled with essentials, milk, bread, some canned food, and a small pack of diapers she had picked up for the baby. When she swiped her card, the machine beeped loudly, flashing the words she had been dreading. Heat crawled up her neck. Her hands clenched around the cart handle as the cashier gave her a look, not cruel, but full of pity. She wanted to disappear. Behind her, two women whispered. That's the girl whose husband left her. Pregnant and broke? How's she going to raise a kid? Emma's breath hitched. She felt like she was suffocating. She wanted to scream, to tell them to shut up, to tell them that she was doing her best. But her pride was already in shambles, and she couldn't afford to break down now. Instead, she swallowed her shame, put back the diapers, and walked out with her head held high. Even though she felt like dying inside. The months crawled by. Her body changed. The baby grew. And she was still alone. But nothing compared to the night she went into labor. The contractions hit like waves, violent and relentless. She gasped, gripping the edge of the couch, panic curling in her stomach. There was no Ethan to drive her to the hospital, no one to hold her hand through the pain. She called a cab, biting down on her lip to keep from screaming as she rode through the empty streets. The driver said nothing, but she could feel his eyes flicker to the rearview mirror, watching as she breathed through the pain. Hours later, the hospital room was filled with the sound of her screams. There was no husband pacing the floors, no one holding her through the contractions, no one whispering how strong she was. Just her and the life she had fought to protect. And then, as the final wave of pain crashed over her, as she felt her body break and mend all at once, a new sound filled the air. A baby's cry. Emma sobbed, reaching out with shaking arms as the nurse placed the tiny, warm bundle against her chest. The moment she saw him, everything changed. He was perfect. Soft, warm, fragile. His tiny fingers curled against her skin, and as she looked down at his face, her heart broke all over again. Not for herself. For him. For the father who had walked away before he even had a chance to meet him. Tears blurred her vision as she traced the outline of his delicate features. He looked like Ethan. And yet, he was entirely hers. She bent her head, pressing a trembling kiss to his forehead. "I will give you everything," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Even if I have nothing." At that moment, something inside her shifted. For the first time in months, Emma didn't feel broken. She felt strong. Because this child would never feel abandoned. Never feel unloved. Never feel like he wasn't enough. She would make sure of it. She looked at the world differently now. The whispers, the stares, the pity, they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the tiny heartbeat against her chest. And the silent promise she made that night. One day, Ethan would regret everything. One day, he would see their son and realize what he had lost. And on that day, Emma would no longer be the woman he left behind. She would be someone untouchable. Someone he could never have again. The world hadn't changed, but Emma had. The morning light streamed through the tiny cracks in her worn-out curtains, casting soft golden patterns on the floor. She had barely slept, again. The baby monitor buzzed softly beside her, a reminder that her world was no longer just about her own survival. She had a son now. A son who depended on her for everything. Emma rubbed her tired eyes and sat up. The apartment was small, cramped, barely enough for the two of them, but it was theirs. She had fought for it, paid for it, and kept it standing when she had no one else to rely on. She glanced at the clock. 4:30 a.m. Her shift at the diner started at 6. If she didn't leave soon, she'd be late, and that meant losing the one source of income she had. Quietly, she got up, careful not to wake the baby sleeping peacefully in his crib. She dressed quickly, throwing on her worn-out uniform, pulling her hair into a tight ponytail. There was no time for vanity anymore, survival came first. Her days were a blur of exhaustion. The morning shift at the diner was relentless. She served coffee with a smile, cleaned tables until her hands ached, and carried heavy trays while the muscles in her back screamed for rest. But she never complained. Complaining wouldn't pay the bills. By noon, she rushed to the daycare, picking up her son before heading to her second job at a local retail store. The hours stretched endlessly, her feet barely keeping up, but she never allowed herself to break. There was no one to catch her if she fell. Nights were the hardest. By the time she got home, she was too tired to eat, too drained to do anything but collapse on the bed. But then, a tiny cry would echo through the room, and suddenly, exhaustion didn't matter anymore. She would scoop up her son, hold him close, breathe in the scent of his soft baby skin, and remind herself why she was doing this. "For you," she whispered one night, rocking him in her arms. "Everything I do is for you." But deep down, there was another truth she wouldn't say out loud. She was also doing this for herself. To prove to the world, and to Ethan, that she was stronger than they ever believed. The first few months were brutal. The money barely stretched. The bills kept piling up. Every paycheck disappeared before she could catch her breath. She started teaching herself new skills in the few moments of peace she had. When the baby napped, she watched online tutorials, learning everything she could about marketing, business, and personal development. She read books about strong women, successful women, self-made women. And then, one day, she saw it. A job listing at a local business firm, entry-level marketing assistant. No experience required. Emma hesitated. She had never worked in an office before. She didn't have a fancy degree. But she had nothing to lose. She stayed up the entire night, crafting a resume from scratch. She listed everything: the budgeting she had learned from surviving alone, the time management she had mastered balancing 2 jobs, the customer service skills from her years of working with people. When she submitted it, she didn't expect a response. But the call came 2 days later. "We'd like to schedule an interview." Emma stood frozen, the phone pressed against her ear. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. This was it. Her first real chance at a future. The interview was terrifying. She sat in a room full of people in expensive suits, feeling like an imposter in her thrift store blazer. But she didn't let it shake her. She answered every question with confidence, not because she wasn't scared, but because she had survived worse. At the end of the meeting, the manager leaned forward and studied her. "You don't have the traditional experience we usually look for," he admitted. "But you have something better." Emma held her breath. "You have grit." She got the job. And just like that, her life began to change. The days were still long, but the work was different. She wasn't scrubbing tables or folding clothes, she was learning marketing strategies, branding techniques, the power of digital storytelling. She absorbed everything like a sponge, staying late to practice, working twice as hard as anyone else in the office. And then, one day, she got her first promotion. The salary increase was small, but it was enough to move out of the tiny apartment. She still remembered the day she held the keys to their new home, a modest but beautiful place with space for her son to run, a kitchen that didn't leak, and windows that let in the morning sun. She stood in the middle of the empty living room, holding her child on her hip, and for the first time in years, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We made it," she whispered. She had done it without Ethan. Without his money. Without his love. Without his support. She had built something on her own. The months passed. Emma climbed higher in the company. She stopped being the struggling single mother. She became a name people respected, a woman people admired. She traded her thrift store blazer for tailored suits. She walked with confidence, her head held high, no longer the woman who had once begged a man to stay. And then, one day, the moment she never saw coming arrived. A meeting at work. A new potential client coming in for consultation. The receptionist peeked into her office and said, "Emma, he's here." She glanced at her schedule, barely registering the name. Then, the door opened. And there he was. Ethan. Her past, standing in the doorway. His eyes widened the moment he saw her, as if he couldn't believe what he was looking at. And maybe he couldn't. Because the woman sitting in front of him wasn't the same woman he had left. She was stronger, more powerful, untouchable. She watched as his face paled, his posture stiffened. "Emma?" His voice was hesitant, unsure. She tilted her head slightly, pretending to think. "I'm sorry," she said smoothly. "Do I know you?" The color drained from his face. For the first time in years, she had the power. And God, did it feel good. The woman who had cried for him was gone. The woman in front of him now? She was untouchable. Ethan used to believe that life was about choices. And he had made his. When he walked out of that tiny apartment, leaving Emma pregnant and crying, he had felt nothing but relief. He was free. Free from responsibilities, free from commitment, free from a life that felt like a trap. He had stepped into a brand new world with Samantha, the woman he had convinced himself he deserved. Unlike Emma, Samantha wasn't soft and selfless. She was wild, adventurous, and knew how to have fun. Their relationship was thrilling. Spontaneous vacations, expensive dinners, the kind of passion that made him feel alive. For the first few months, everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. It started with the little things. Samantha's late nights out. The way she ignored his texts more and more. The way she flirted so openly with other men in front of him. Ethan brushed it off. She was just playful. That was who she was. Then, one evening, he came home early. He opened the door, expecting to find Samantha watching TV or drinking wine like she always did. Instead, he heard laughter. A man's voice. And then, something worse. The unmistakable sound of whispers and hurried movements. His stomach dropped. His hands clenched into fists as he stormed into the bedroom, their bedroom. There she was, wrapped in nothing but a sheet, smirking at him like he was an idiot. And beside her, a man pulling on his shirt, his face barely masking his amusement. Ethan's world tilted. His vision blurred with rage, humiliation clawing at his throat. She didn't even look guilty. "Are you serious?" he managed to choke out. Samantha only laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, come on, Ethan. Don't act so surprised. You didn't really think you were enough for me, did you?" The words hit him harder than a slap. You didn't really think you were enough. She didn't love him. She never had. He had left everything behind for her. His wife. His unborn child. For this? And the worst part? She was right. He wasn't enough. Not for her. Not for anyone. That night, he packed his bags, the same way he had once packed them when he left Emma. But this time? There was no excitement. No freedom. No escape. Just emptiness. The beginning of the end. After Samantha, everything spiraled. His business, once thriving, started crumbling. Investors pulled out. Clients lost confidence in him. His reputation, the one thing he had always prided himself on, was in ruins. He tried to ignore the whispers in the office. He's losing everything. Ever since he left his wife, it's been downhill. Karma, man. It always comes back around. He told himself it was just a rough patch. He could fix it. He had built this company from nothing, he could bring it back. But then the lawsuits came. The debts piled up. And one day, he walked into work only to be met with security. "Mr. Ethan, we need you to leave. You no longer have any authority here." The company he had built, the empire he had sacrificed everything for? It wasn't his anymore. He had nothing left. For the first time since he left Emma, he felt panic. He had assumed he could always bounce back. That he would never be the one struggling. But life had a cruel way of humbling men like him. The first regret. He spent the next few months watching his life fall apart piece by piece. His savings dwindled. His apartment, the sleek, modern one he had once bragged about, was gone. He moved into a small, dingy place that smelled of regret and cheap alcohol. And then, one night, when he had nothing left to distract himself, he opened his phone. A notification from an old friend. A link. "Dude, isn't this your ex?" Ethan frowned and clicked on it. The moment the article loaded, his heart stopped. It was Emma. But not the Emma he had left. Not the woman who had stood in that tiny apartment, begging him to stay, clutching an ultrasound with tear-filled eyes. No. This woman was unrecognizable. The article was about a successful marketing executive, a self-made woman who had risen from nothing. The accompanying photo? A stunning image of Emma standing in front of a high-rise building, dressed in a sharp black suit, her hair sleek, her posture confident. Her eyes, the same ones that had once looked at him with love, were now filled with something else. Strength. Power. Control. Ethan stared. How? How had she gone from the heartbroken woman he abandoned to this? His fingers trembled as he scrolled further. More pictures. Emma at a business gala, shaking hands with CEOs. Emma receiving an award. Emma at an exclusive event, standing beside powerful people. And then, the photo that destroyed him. Emma in a park. Holding a little boy's hand. His son. Their son. The child he had never met. Ethan's entire body went numb. He zoomed in, staring at the boy. His features were unmistakable. He had Ethan's dark hair, his sharp jawline. His son. His hands clenched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. How old was he now? 3? 4? He had missed everything. Every first step. Every first word. Every laugh, every tear. And Emma. She had raised him without him. She had moved on without him. And she had done it better than he ever could. Ethan scrolled through more of her posts, searching for something, anything, that showed she still thought about him. There was nothing. No bitter comments. No references to the past. Like he had never even existed. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. For the first time in his life, he felt true regret. Because he had always assumed he could come back. That when he was ready, when he had lived his fun, reckless life, Emma would still be there. Waiting. But she wasn't. She had erased him. Completely. And now? Now, he was the one left behind. The one watching from the sidelines. The one who lost everything. And the worst part? He deserved it. The cafe was quiet, the gentle hum of conversation blending with the soft clatter of silverware. Ethan sat at a corner table, stirring his coffee absently, his mind elsewhere. It had been months since he first saw that article about Emma, months since his life had come crashing down around him. He had lost everything, his company, his apartment, even the confidence that had once been his trademark. But none of it haunted him quite like that one image, Emma in the park, holding their son's hand. That picture had burned itself into his memory. He had stalked her social media, searched her name endlessly, hoping for more glimpses into the life she had built without him. But she was careful, private. There were no direct mentions of him, no breadcrumbs leading back to their past. He had convinced himself that seeing her in person would be impossible. That she had disappeared into a world he no longer belonged to. Until today. Ethan almost missed her at first. He had been walking through the city, head down, lost in thought, when the sound of laughter froze him in place. A child's laugh, pure, unrestrained joy. And then, a voice. "Mommy, look!" His entire body went rigid. He turned instinctively, following the sound, and there she was. Emma. Standing on the other side of the street, holding a little boy's hand. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It felt like the world had just stopped. She was different, yet still the same. More radiant, more confident. The once soft woman he had walked away from was now poised, untouchable. She wore a sleek black dress, her hair cascading over her shoulders in waves. She looked like a woman who had conquered the world. But it wasn't just her. It was him. The boy. Their son. Ethan's entire body locked up as his eyes fixed on the child he had never met, never held, never even known existed outside of that one picture. And God, he looked exactly like him. The sharp jawline. The dark hair. The same dimple that had once charmed its way into people's hearts. The realization hit him like a truck. This was his son. His blood. The child he had abandoned before he even took his first breath. And now, here he was, standing beside the mother who had raised him alone. Ethan took a step forward, his heart slamming against his ribs. He couldn't look away. He watched as the boy, his son, jumped up and down, pulling on Emma's hand, showing her something in the store window. Emma bent down, smiling softly as she listened to him. That smile. He hadn't seen it in years. And now? It wasn't for him. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. He felt cold. Numb. Like something inside him had just collapsed. He had spent years pretending his past didn't exist. Convinced himself he had made the right decision. But this? Seeing them together, seeing the child that could have been his world? This was something he could never prepare for. He took another step forward, his pulse hammering. He had to talk to her. Emma, he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't hear him. She was too focused on their son. On the life that had nothing to do with him. Ethan swallowed hard and moved faster, crossing the street, his feet feeling heavier with every step. Emma. This time, she froze. Slowly, she turned. And when their eyes met, Ethan felt like he had been punched in the gut. There was no warmth in her gaze. No sadness. No pain. Just indifference. For the first time in his life, Ethan realized something terrifying. She didn't care anymore. The woman who had once begged him to stay, who had cried when he walked away, who had once looked at him like he was her entire world, no longer saw him at all. The little boy tugged at her hand, looking up curiously. Mommy? Who's that? Emma's eyes didn't leave Ethan's. But she smiled. A soft, reassuring smile. No one important, sweetheart, she said, gently squeezing their son's hand. Ethan's chest tightened. No one important? Emma, please. His voice cracked. He hated how desperate he sounded. She raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. Please, what? She asked calmly. Ethan struggled to find the words. Everything he wanted to say felt stuck in his throat. He glanced down at the boy, his boy. I didn't know it would be like this, he admitted, his voice hollow. Emma let out a soft laugh, not amused. Not angry. Just done. What exactly did you think it would be like, Ethan? She asked, tilting her head. He opened his mouth, but he had nothing. Because what excuse could he give? That he had been young? That he had been stupid? That he had thought leaving was the right choice? None of it would change the fact that he had missed everything. First words. First steps. Birthdays. Laughter. Love. He had missed it all. And now, he was just a stranger. I just want to talk, he tried again, stepping closer. Emma held up a hand. No. Ethan froze. Emma. No, Ethan, she repeated, firmer this time. Her grip on their son's hand tightened as she took a step back. She wasn't scared. She wasn't nervous. She was in control. You made your choice, she said quietly, her voice steady. Now live with it. And then, she turned her back on him. She walked away, their son's laughter ringing through the air as they disappeared into the crowd. Ethan stood there, frozen, his hands trembling at his sides. For years, he had convinced himself that one day, he could go back. That one day, Emma would still be waiting. That one day, he could fix everything. But that day would never come. Because Emma didn't belong to him anymore. And neither did their son. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood what true regret felt like. And he would have to live with it. Forever. The first time Ethan tried to come back, Emma wasn't surprised. She had seen it before, men like him always came back. When their world crumbled, when the life they abandoned wasn't as golden as they had imagined, when regret gnawed at them so deeply that they had nowhere else to turn. But she had nothing left to give him. It started with small things. A message she didn't reply to. A call she let ring. Then, a voicemail she didn't bother listening to. Then, he showed up. She had been walking through the city after work, her heels clicking against the pavement, her thoughts filled with the quiet joy of knowing she had built something for herself, when she heard his voice. Emma. She didn't turn. She heard his footsteps quicken, closing the distance between them, desperation dripping from every step. Emma, please. Just wait. She sighed. Not out of sadness. Not even out of anger. Just exhaustion. She turned, her face blank, her posture calm. The man standing in front of her was a ghost of the Ethan she once knew. He looked older, weaker. The suit that once fit him perfectly now seemed a little too loose, his confident smirk replaced by uncertainty. I need to talk to you, he said, shifting on his feet. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. Why? He hesitated, as if he didn't know how to say it, as if there were 1,000 words clawing at his throat but none strong enough to undo the past. I made a mistake. His voice cracked slightly. I left something I should have held on to. And now, I don't know how to fix it. She stared at him, silent. Once upon a time, those words might have broken her. Might have made her soften, made her want to give him another chance. But that girl didn't exist anymore. You didn't just leave me, Ethan, she said, her voice steady, emotionless. You left him. His face twisted in pain. I know. And I missed so much, Emma. I just want to be his father. Please. A flicker of something ran through her chest, not pain, not sympathy. Just finality. A father is someone who stays, she said simply. You were never one. Ethan flinched like she had physically hit him. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it, a small smile pulling at her lips. He's waiting for me, she said, stepping back. Emma, wait. She didn't. She turned and walked away, the same way he had walked away from her years ago. He didn't get to come back just because it was convenient for him now. Not when she had spent years bleeding for his absence. Not when she had spent nights whispering promises to their son that he would never feel the way she had been left to feel. Not when she had built a world where Ethan no longer existed. Not when he had already been replaced. The last time Ethan saw them, it was a crisp autumn afternoon. He hadn't meant to see them. He had just been walking through the city, his hands buried in his pockets, his thoughts heavy with the weight of everything he had lost. And then, there they were. Emma, laughing. Her head tilted back, her eyes bright, her entire being glowing with the peace of someone who had long since let go of their ghosts. And beside her, a little boy, holding her hand. Ethan's feet froze to the pavement. His son. The son he had never held. The son whose first words, first steps, first laughs, he had missed it all. And standing next to them was a man. Tall. Strong. Confident. His hand rested on the boy's small shoulder with a gentleness that Ethan had never known how to give. Ethan watched as his son turned to him, his tiny face lighting up with pure joy. Daddy. The word stabbed through his chest like a blade. Not because it was spoken. But because it wasn't meant for him. The man smiled, bending down, ruffling the boy's hair before lifting him into his arms. Ethan's stomach twisted, his entire body locking up. This was it. The final moment. The moment where he finally understood that there was no place for him anymore. He had walked away thinking he was choosing freedom. But what he really chose was emptiness. Emma turned then, her gaze meeting his across the distance. There was no anger in her eyes. No resentment. That would have been easier. Because what he saw instead was worse. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger on the street. And then, she turned away, laughing softly as she reached for the hand of the man beside her. They walked away, their son's giggles filling the air. Ethan stood there, watching the family that should have been his disappear into the golden light of the afternoon. And for the first time in his life, he felt tears burning in his eyes. But this time, they meant nothing to her.